Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Joe Dresden. I'm the Senior Program Associate here at the Kennan Institute. And I want to thank all of you for joining us here today, those in the room and those online, for a program that focuses on how Ukrainian artists are fighting back and defending their nation's threatened culture. We're running this event today in association with Culture Quest from PBS, and we thank them for loaning us not just their video, but their filmmaker for this project. Before we begin with the film, I want to encourage you to stay up to date on the latest from the Kennan Institute by visiting our website and subscribing to our blogs, Focus Ukraine and the Russia File, as well as our Russian language blog, if you have the capacity to read it, called In Other Words. And please also keep an eye out for our podcasts, Kennan X and the Russia File. You can also visit our Hindsight Up Front Ukraine collection on the Wilson Center website for the latest from the entire Wilson Center on news and analysis focused on Ukraine. For our online audience today, if you would like to ask a question for today's event, please submit it via email to kennan@wilsoncenter.org, on our Facebook, or at our Twitter account @Kennan Institute. Please include your name and affiliation when sending your question. Today I'll begin by introducing our speakers. Ian Grant is a filmmaker and creator and host of PBS's Culture Quest. The Culture Quest series has followed the world's artists, artisans, and keepers of culture. In its first season, the series took viewers to places like Western Mongolia, East Timor, and the north coast of Australia, giving a behind-the-scenes look at how people around the world express their struggles and their successes through art and culture, and earned an Emmy nomination in the process. Ian is also a business owner. He and his team specialize in salvaging and reclaiming materials from around the world to create unique pieces and furniture sets. His company now thrives in the reclaimed materials world, as well as artifacts and objects. In 2009, Ian won an Emmy for a series that he produced based on the Travel Channel. And the title of the series was called The Relic Hunter with Ian Grant. It followed him around the world, giving audiences a firsthand look at what he did for a living. And Mr. Grant will be joined on stage with us by Dr. Blair Ruble, Distinguished Fellow here at the Wilson Center and former Director of the Kennan Institute, my former boss. He is the author of a number of books and articles and contributes to a weekly Arts of War blog series on Ukrainian artists and the resilience in the face of Russia's all-out invasion of Ukraine. Mr. Grant, I invite you to the stage.
Hi everyone, and everyone online, hello. Thanks Blair and Joe and Kennan Institute for inviting me, Ian Grant. And my show Culture Quest uses art and culture and artisanship as a window into the people, the places that are producing all these things. And I love the idea of approaching art and culture as not something under glass, especially culture, as not something that existed only in the past. I like the idea of approaching it as a living, sort of breathing thing that evolves along with the people that are practicing it. And I also am a big fan of when art can be transformative and do something really important in people's lives, not just for the artists, but for the people looking at it, the people that are inspired by it. And when Russia broadened its invasion on February 24th. I started seeing all these images, artists, musicians, filmmakers, writers, producing these volumes of work, all about the war, of course. And it was showing up in newspapers in the United States and all around the world and having an unbelievable effect. And for me, that was exactly what I like to chase after in this show. This is about how something as tragic and offensive as this war, art can stand up and do something performative, do something that can make a very distinct change, not only in the lives of Ukrainians, but it's also able to affect, it's also able to keep the world aware of what's going on in Ukraine. So those Ukrainians don't feel alone. They're not left to fight this battle on their own. And as a result, the art, the music, the writing, the movies, all these elements come together and are really bolstering Ukrainian society. And in the dollars and cents world, they're also raising a lot of money, which is a critically important thing for what's going on in Ukraine. But I'm getting off track because I meant to just introduce the video. Well, what we did was I edited down our hour-long special episode on Ukraine that's airing on PBS. Ask your local stations when they're going to air it. To, I think, a 27-minute episode. Is that right? Nodding? Yeah, all right. There's one little glitch in it, but that's not going to happen on PBS. So this is especially for in this hall and you people in the comfort of your own home. So here we go. The 14-hour overnight train ride from the sleepy border town of Chelm, Poland to Kiev is one of only a handful of ways you can get to one of Europe's great capital cities during the war. Hour upon hour through villages, farms, factory towns, wide open fields and forests. It's also on these trains that hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians fled the country at the outset of Russia's invasion on February 24th. Some on this very train, in this exact cabin, their lives upended. Kiev itself is a classically beautiful European capital city of almost 3 million people. Stunning old buildings, modern new ones, restaurants, clubs, museums, people out going about their day. And as a visitor to the city on a beautiful September day, you get a sense of normalcy at first. But that sense of normalcy starts to disappear a bit as your traveler's eye takes in the details of the city in its current state. The number of people in fatigues, the sandbagged and concrete-enclosed statues, concrete blocks and welded-together steel I-beams used to obstruct and derail tanks are scattered around the city, ready to be pushed into the streets. And below the Independence column in Maidan Square in the center of the city is a little grassy knoll filled with Ukrainian flags with the names of the dead from the war written on them. In a war whose intent seems in part to erase Ukrainian culture, it's that culture itself that has risen up to help unify the country. All of the artists, musicians, curators, satirists, all using their talents to contribute in any way they can, to help galvanize Ukrainians in the fight for the survival of their country, both its proud heritage and its potential future. And it's because of that cultural front that we're here in Ukraine. Our first stop is at Mistetsky Arsenal, one of the most prominent museums in the country, to meet with its director. Mistetsky Arsenal is the largest cultural museum in Ukraine, housed in a massively impressive building that used to be an actual arsenal and fortification well into the 20th century. And this is the museum's director, Olesia Ostrovska-Liuta. She holds and has held several board and committee positions over the years and has a master's in cultural studies. Because cultural centers have been targets during the war, the museum removed and hid all of its artworks. But in normal times, it's an incredibly vibrant place. Arsenal discusses what's valuable in society, often focusing on social debates, digging into those issues through the lens of contemporary art.
And we also try to uncover what is unknown in culture to our audiences, and paradoxically, that's often the Ukrainian culture. Because through the 20th century, Ukrainian culture was really hidden until 1991, when Ukraine gained its independence. You couldn't speak about many issues, both political and cultural, and that led to a situation where you have quite little knowledge about many phenomena. The Ukrainian language was banned from public usage in the 19th century. You couldn't teach it in school, you couldn't publish books in Ukrainian, you couldn't publish
in the
notes.
19th century?
Yes,
Okay.
by Tsarist Russia. Lenin thought it was impossible to keep Ukraine within the Russian body without giving Ukraine some autonomy. Therefore, they started this Ukrainization policy, which meant keeping bureaucracy in Ukrainian language, introducing Ukrainian language to school. You had Ukrainian theaters, Ukrainian writers, Ukrainian publishing houses.
Boy, there was a lot going on in the 20s.
Exactly. There was a very fruitful period which ended with a huge massacre.
In the 30s with Stalin's purges.
Exactly. He executed Holodomor, which is political famine in Ukraine, which took up 4 million deaths, to curtail this Ukrainization policy, to make Ukraine more homogeneous with Russia. When Stalin introduced social realist doctrine, authors that were not social realists were physically executed. And those were hundreds of Ukrainian cultural figures, hundreds.
Cultural leaders of all types, from writers, educators, musicians, artists, were all at risk of imprisonment or execution and their works destroyed. Like the artist Mikhailo Boychuk.
Boychukism was a modernist phenomenon of the 20th century. After the movement was banned, its leader, Mikhailo Boychuk, was physically executed. The murals were destroyed. Only a limited number of artifacts remained because some other cultural figures, artists, preserved them by hiding them in their apartments. For Ukrainian culture, it was absolutely devastating.
Yeah, you just wiped out an entire generation of knowledge and creation.
I think it's a common knowledge on Ukrainian cultural scene now that 2020s were the next fruitful period. That's why for the cultural scene, this invasion falls into the pattern of destruction, and it brings all the expectations and emotions, but also a lot of fear and resistance. What we also know from our history that appeasing the aggressor, agreeing to certain level of terror to avert larger terror doesn't work. Now imagine the moment when we read all sorts of letters from, let's say, European intellectuals calling to end this war and accept a compromise with Russia. When I look at such a letter, I suddenly imagine what will happen next. I see only atrocities and destruction in the future. Learning about our culture now is a part of our resilience as a society. Every piece of culture that is destroyed, every piece of culture that is questioned by the aggressor, by Russians, is worth standing for.
So in the face of the Russian invasion making it to suburban cities like Irpin and Bucha, just a handful of miles outside of Kiev, and leaving a trail of destruction in their wake, with the reality of Russians targeting museums, churches, and other cultural centers, with museum employees having their own families to take care of during the invasion, Alessia and her team stayed to protect the museum.
None of my museum department team fled. Actually, all of them stayed. It didn't seem neither exotic nor very brave or anything. It was just one of the strategies that people in Kiev were using.
Yeah.
It was just the way people resisted. You absolutely cannot agree to being erased again.
When the war started, what happened to everything?
Our team, the team of Arsenal, had a few tasks, major tasks. One task was collection protection, to care for the collection, to prepare it for evacuation, to perform evacuation, to stay also in Kiev to coordinate with other services in Kiev.
Well, and this is, I assume, happening at museums
Yes.
all over the place.
Another part of the team was communicating, writing letters to explain what's going on and supporting Ukrainian authors abroad. And then a new function added to add to the resilience of people in Ukraine.
So in the middle of the war, they got back to what they do best, starting conversations through art.
We thought that this is a moment to do an exhibition about this. How do you read art today after what happened to you?
They realized that things took on new meanings during the war, from simple daily phrases to centuries-old works of art.
There was an old Soviet cliche, wish, I wish you clear skies above your head, which seemed as an absolutely empty phrase. I could hear it all through my childhood.
Yeah.
And it was such an empty phrase. But after what happens to you with this invasion, it suddenly gets such a literary meaning.
I wish you clear skies, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. The exhibition showed works that now held very different meanings to the people looking at them through the lens of the war they are living in.
For example, when you look at biblical scenes, and Exodus now reminds you the experience of evacuation in Kiev.
Yeah.
And that was a real exodus. You had hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people trying to leave at the same time.
A 1980s painting of a beach scene in Odessa now reminds viewers of the landmines buried there. A whimsical work of two nude carpenters looks like a home with its roof blown off to one person, or the promise of reconstruction to another.
Our team who was working in very hard conditions. But the experience of our team were not unique. They were quite typical of the experience of people in Kiev.
So they created a video exhibition of all their curatorial staff describing their experiences during the war.
At the beginning of the exhibition, we opened the exhibition. It was very well perceived.
So you were able to open it in here?
Yes. It was not as huge as we used to do. This exhibition was much smaller compared to what we used to do.
It's amazing that you managed to put on an exhibition in the middle of the war.
This is what we thought too.
Yeah.
And also you have to do rather smaller exhibitions for security reasons, because you have to be able to evacuate.
And they quickly discovered that this exhibition was inspiring their visitors to talk about their experiences during the war.
There was such a sign that this resonates, that people need to tell their stories. We have a shared experience.
So they created a space in the museum where their visitors could record their stories from the war.
We prepared a set so that they could put their cell phone on a how do you call this thing?
No, I get it. Okay.
There was light.
Yeah.
There was it was quite an intimate space.
Mm-hmm. The visitors could use this space to record something for themselves, or if they wanted to, they could also share it with the museum. I like that idea of not drawing a line between your curatorial staff and the public, because they have shared experiences in it, and it makes the public feel not like visitors in this space. Makes them feel like they're a part of...
It's a space for all of us.
Yeah.
Now in Kiev, we are heading to the hardest winter since Ukraine's independence, maybe even since World War II. So we'll see.
Hardest winter because of all of the
gas shortages,
all these other issues,
infrastructure being targeted by missiles and artillery. So we'll see how it goes.
So you kind of live in a foot in two worlds, because you obviously have to deal with the here and now and try and be as flexible and nimble as possible with the war, but you still have to look forward.
We're quite used to living in a few scenarios. Scenario 1 is catastrophic, scenario 3 is optimistic, and then you have a middle scenario. So we are used to doing that. One problem with that is that it's very hard to advance when you have to plan for so many scenarios all the time. But I think we'll be all right. I hope we'll be all right.
And then there's music.
Коли настане день.
Okean Elzy and its frontman Slava Vakarchuk, a band used to playing packed stadiums around Europe, now plays for the front lines and does countless interviews and charity concerts. The indie folk band Daka Braka has a worldwide fundraising tour that barely leaves time for travel in between gigs. And there are countless others in all genres of music doing whatever they can to make a difference. Which led us to the wildly popular group Onuka and their lead singer NATA Shizhenko.
Please don't try to explain, as you don't understand.
NATA's own family is steeped in Ukrainian culture, and that culture is infused throughout their music. Some of Onuka's greatest live performances are playing alongside the National Academic Orchestra of Folk Instruments. NATA and her husband Eugene Filatov, who is NATA's other creative half and co-founder of Onuka, and their young son Sasha live in Kiev, but their home in Chernihiv has been in the family for 5 generations. NATA, only 2 days back from a charity concert in Lisbon, Spain, was kind enough to invite us up to their home there to spend the day with her, and her brother Sasha gave us a ride. Chernihiv is around 150 kilometers north of Kiev, along one of the 2 main highways the Russians used to try and take Kiev in February and March. It's also along this highway that the world saw some of the first signs of Ukrainians fighting back and winning. All along the way, there are little villages destroyed, military roadblocks every 10 or 20 kilometers, tank tracks embedded in the highway's asphalt. And you never escape the air raid sirens here. The siege of Chernihiv started on the 2nd day of the invasion, February 25th, cutting off Chernihiv from Kiev and the rest of the country with regular and seemingly indiscriminate shelling of the city, killing hundreds over the next several weeks. But it all ended around March 31st, when the Ukrainians were able to retake the highway we just came up on, reconnecting Kiev with Chernihiv, pushing out the Russian troops and ending the siege of the city. Chernihiv is one of the most ancient cities in Ukraine, dating back to the 700s, with deep cultural roots. And you would be hard-pressed to find a stronger advocate for that culture than NATA. With that in mind, we start out in the early 1990s. I mean, you started playing which instrument?
Sopilka. It started from sopilka.
But this is you at a super young age.
Yeah, 9 maybe,
Yeah.
9. But I started at 4. He taught me, my grandfather, how to play, and I started to play some tunes. And then they became more complicated, and I started to play with orchestras. This is about the impact of my grandfather, who really is my teacher in life.
The band's name Onuka actually means granddaughter, a direct homage to her grandfather. Well, and your grandfather was a big deal in the musical instrument world here.
He's pretty well known, and he made a lot of folk instruments of Ukrainian, instruments of other countries.
NATA's grandfather, Alexander Slonchik, won several national awards and honors during the Soviet Union days. And this was his home workshop, where he and NATA spent countless hours.
He encouraged me to fall in love with Ukraine in childhood, to fall in love with music, with Ukrainian history, with motherland. And it was not like a kind of lectures, it was just a dialogue between granddaughter and grandfather.
Well, it's like this room in a way.
Yeah.
It's just infusing you. All those little moments kind of seep into your DNA.
Yeah, I think that you got it, actually.
That love for folk music would become the foundation for Onuka.
I think that folk, it's so big punch of knowledge, of customs, of traditions, of philosophy.
The part that I thought was so cool about it was what's going on in here is tradition and culture and just an interest in your past, yet your music is super modern.
Я натискати відлік. Тільки майбутнє готовий.
I wanted to play electronica by Ukrainian instruments. I wanted to show how bandura can sound, how cymbalum, how sopilkas and all these our instruments can sound weird, modern, unique.
Літаю в небі я, літаю в небі він.
To show Ukrainian young people how our instruments can look like, can sound like,
Мелодія моя.
and to be proud of Ukrainian culture.
Today is, what is it, September, I guess
We
I
are
watched-
waiting for
September
October.
18th. Watching the news, there seems like there's great progress going on, or progress going on the east.
Yeah.
But all these areas are starting to be taken
Unoccupied.
back. Unoccupied.
Yeah.
There's also hard stories coming out of
Yeah.
that. Do you allow yourself room for hope? You know,
Yeah,
and
space for hope.
space for hope in this.
There is nothing except hope. I have never felt so happy to live here, to belong here, to know what my purpose is. My purpose is to make Ukraine blossom. I understand it like a cultural front, the front line of culture.
Oh yeah, yeah.
What our artists and colleagues do with this donating and charity concerts. I think that this, the front line of culture is also very important, and it's not in comparison with the real front line,
Yeah.
but it's supporting arrearguard of it.
We're here because of exactly what you're talking about this second front of culture. I mean, we're not war correspondents. You know, this is a television series about art around culture around the world, and it was seeing Slava Vakarchuk.
Yeah.
I saw him playing the piano, singing this like raspy voice, beautiful, heart-wrenching song. This is a beautiful song. I mean, it was like, wow, that's incredible. And then I saw a couple artists, and one of them was this guy in the east, and I gotta admit, I don't remember what city it was in, but it was getting shelled, just beaten up. And he was in a cellar, and he was with the family, and he's an artist, and he just started sketching. So, and somehow these sketches came out and wound up, I think, in the New York Times or something like that. But I was like, wow, this is also incredible, because it's art, and art's getting out and influencing people around the world. And it was at that stage that I thought, we got to go there. Onuka has had a non-stop fundraising tour all across Europe, as well as a 6-city charity tour across the United States when this happened.
There was a moment we had such bracelets with Ukrainian flags, and we have a lot of equipment like instruments, and we were just having some domestic flights in America, and the captain saw these bracelets, and he made an announcement there. Here is musical orchestra from Ukraine, and they're touring the world with charity concerts, and everyone was applauding, and it was a moment like in a movie. It was some kind of this moment when you understand that you are not alone in this.
Yeah. We spent the last few hours of our stay here filming around town before our train ride back to Poland. While filming right under the Independence column in Maidan Square, I happened to see some beautifully painted I-beam battlements that are actually called Hedgehogs across the street. I had read about these before our trip, that a woman was painting hedgehogs around town with traditional Ukrainian motifs. So we headed over to have a look. While we were filming, a woman came up and set down some boxes next to the hedgehogs and started to unpack her gear. That woman was the person who was painting the hedgehogs, Varvara Lohovin, just happening to come down to the square on a Sunday afternoon to paint some more. I introduced myself and we had a quick chat before heading off to catch our train. But it was this moment of happenstance that for me became the perfect anecdote for what's happening here. While Varvara has a very successful business in her normal life, she also has a university degree in art and wanted to use that talent not only as an outlet of her own expression during the war, her own form of resistance, but also to add something to the people's lives around her, to give them something to smile about, to be inspired by coming down to the center of Kiev on her free time to paint, imbuing an object of war with the cultural motifs of the people it's there to defend. That attitude is my lasting impression of Ukrainians. In a war whose intent is to erase, to cow a population into submission, it's done the exact opposite, uniting a country in a singular fight for their freedom. The people we met with here are representatives of the millions more Ukrainians in all corners of society doing the same thing, contributing in any way they can. Ukrainians were unwillingly dropped into this crucible of war, but as hard and as brutal as it has been, and surely still will be, there seems no doubt in the people's minds we met here that what will emerge from that crucible will be a stronger country, filled with people who have a renewed sense of pride in their history and who will carry their proud culture and country into the future.
I can't wait for it to come out on PBS.
Yeah,
Look forward to it.
it is out now.
Okay. Well, Ian, you want to say about 5 minutes more commentary now that we've all seen the film, and then I will turn the microphone over to Blair.
Sure, I'll keep it really short. So obviously there are a bunch of segments to the episode that aren't in there, but we, or I guess the we is me, because I'm the one that anyhow, we'll get into that later. But I tried really hard to cover the spectrum, and in general the setup for Culture Quest is I like to start out episodes with kind of the, very much in quotations, the classic kind of starving artist, and work my way through to then some major, famous artist of some flavor. And in this case, we mixed it up a little bit, especially starting out with Alessia at the beginning of the episode, because she turned into, I had such a different vision of what that interview was going to be. And it turned into something so much more than I went into it expecting it to be, if that makes any sense. But there were so many other people in this episode. If you saw in the clips towards the end, that sort of real at the end of the closing scene, I mean, we hung out with teenagers, with graffiti artists, with this unbelievably great satirical television show, basically like The Daily Show or Hassan Minhaj, called Toronto Television. And I won't explain why it's called that, but there's actually a funny reason. And they're unbelievably popular in Ukraine. I mean, even NATA, who's this wildly famous singer throughout Ukraine, was like, oh my God, you're going to go meet with Toronto Television? So, and people across Ukraine are getting their news from Toronto Television, and they're doing important work there. And there was this other woman, Katya Taylor, who's this curator, entrepreneur, who has created all these websites as a gathering place for artists to promote their art, but also a place where people can make donations that then in turn go to artists around Ukraine, as well as setting up an exhibition that toured around Europe. So there are a lot of people. There are a lot of impressive people in this episode that frankly, they were all very humbling to me, and in the same breath, inspiring. God willing, I never go through what Ukrainians are going through, but you always, of course, you can't help but think, how would I respond in these situations? Man, I can only hope that I would come fractionally close to the way the people that we met with, how they handle what's going on in their lives day to day, but not just their own lives. They get up in the morning and start thinking about their neighbors' lives, their fellow Ukrainians' lives, and what they can do to make it better and to push this country towards victory. So it was an inspiring trip. There were incredibly hard moments, hard stories, but I tell you, I came away feeling just really, really inspired by the people we met with. So, Blair.
Yeah, thank you, Joe, and thanks for having me. I just want to say before I try to make a point or two, do find the rest of the film. It really is remarkable, and the artists are remarkable, and Ian's work is remarkable, quite frankly. And I will say something he probably would feel uncomfortable saying, but if anybody listening to us supports cultural activities, he has more films he wants to make, and open up your checkbook. So,
I'm not uncomfortable about that.
Okay,
yeah, please,
okay.
yeah.
Because that's how PBS works.
It is.
Thinking back on what was being said on February 24th, February 25th, the first days of the war, there was a widespread assumption that the Russians would have an easy cakewalk. That eventually, sooner rather than later, Ukraine would fold. And there were two surprises that emerged rather quickly. The first was the ineptitude of the Russian army and the powerful impact of unbridled corruption and hollowing out state institutions, and the lie that the Russian Federation had become. That was one surprise. But the other surprise was Ukraine held together. This is a society, I remember chairing meetings in this room. The whole discussion was how it was fragmented. They can't re-elect a president. Only one Ukrainian president's been re-elected. It's corrupt. And yet, when you begin to look at culture and you begin to look at the stories Ian tells and some of the stories I've tried to write about, you realize that over the past 30 years, Ukrainians have created their own society and they've renewed their culture. And so that when the Russian invasion came, all the background of the people he's talking about, they were ready. They were ready to resist, and they had the tools to resist, and they had the tools to shape their art to resist, because over the previous 3 decades of Ukrainian independence, there has come together a new understanding of what Ukraine is, and it's been that understanding emerged and was most visible in culture, and I would say even more so in youth culture. A youth culture that people wanted to participate in, and it was a youth culture that was in the Ukrainian language. So you have hip-hop artists who started out performing in Russian from Eastern Ukraine, but began to switch rather quickly to performing in Ukrainian because they felt that Ukrainian was a language that better expressed what they wanted to say. And that's a story that I think the outside world largely missed because we were focused so much on the politics. But you see echoes of this over and over again in Ian's movie. And I think that that's an important takeaway, that when we think about why it is that Ukraine has survived and resisted, and this was filmed before the winter, and people were wondering if Ukraine would make it through the winter. Well, clearly they have made it through the winter with hardship, but there was something driving them, and the engine, I think, of a lot of that resistance lies in the creation of a very vibrant cultural life that is shared by people in Ukraine. So,
well, a reminder to our audience watching at home that if you have a question, please do submit it via email to kennan@wilsoncenter.org, via Twitter @Kennan Institute, or our Facebook page at any time. And please do include your name and affiliation when sending in your question. But it's my turn to ask a question. And Ian, what made you get on that long train ride? 14 hours by train. What was the thought process? I mean, you saw things on TV. You mentioned a little bit about it, but I mean, where was your head at when you got on that train in Poland?
Yeah, it's so. To try and keep it short, which is really difficult for me, but in general. But my story with Culture Quest is a little different than you might expect. Or working for doing these sorts of shows for PBS is not what the general public. It doesn't go the normal way. I don't get a packet from headquarters saying, "Here's your travel documents. Here's the person you're going to meet. Here's your list of interviews. See you in Kiev." It's a very different setup than Anderson Cooper or Bear Grylls or people like that, who I absolutely love and have envy for them in this very specific regard. But the part that I wouldn't trade is, as a result, basically what it was I am sitting in my home office. My wife is upstairs in her home office. She's in medical devices. She has a medical device consultant. She has nothing to do with this. But it basically was me watching what's going on, yelling up to my wife saying, "I really think I need to do this. This is what this television series is about. How do we do it?" And it went from there. So we were talking about this before we started up here, but my sponsor for this series is a college I'm from Minnesota, is a college called Gustavus Adolphus, and I realize it's PBS, so this sounds like a pitch for it, but I am so unbelievably grateful for Gustavus, genuinely, for stepping up. They made the first season possible, and then they stepped up and made this possible. So it just wouldn't have happened without them. And then I started trying to figure out how to get to Kiev by sitting on my computer at home. And all right, I can't fly there. What border crossings can I get to? Do I take a bus? Do I take a car? Do I take a train? Do I go to Warsaw? I mean, it took a long time, and it was hard to find people who were they were willing, but they weren't able to tell me how to do it because no one really knew or what documents. So I ended up, and it's just my cinematographer, whose name is Ian as well, Ian Levasseur, He and I are great, great friends, and we travel really well together. So I called him up and said, hey, how do you feel about shooting? This is a 1-hour special. How do you feel about shooting a special in Ukraine? He said, yeah, let's do it. So fast forward, we flew, he's in LA, but we met in, I think in Amsterdam, flew to Warsaw, got on a 3-hour car ride to Helm, and then got on that train ride, got stared at by both sides of Polish and Ukrainian customs because we have no credentials whatsoever. And especially the Ukrainian, well, both sets of border guards looked at us like, what the hell are you doing here? And all I could come up with was to prove that, we're not up to any nefarious things other than the list of people that we were going to meet with was, look, I have a Facebook page. That's got to be legitimate, right? So anyhow, and
not just anyone gets one
yeah,
of those.
exactly. Therein lies the joke. But all the border guards just shook their head at me and went on their way, stamped our passports. So that's how I got to Kiev.
You must have had a team, though, right, who set up these interviews or at least advised you on who to talk to?
No, it is me. I'm not, I mean, it just is. That's just the way it works. So I have to come up with the money, and I have to come up with the whole thing. And you know what? There's no other network. This is totally a pitch for PBS. For public television, no other network would do this. Travel Channel wouldn't do it because we don't have ghosts. Discovery Channel wouldn't do it. CNN would do it for sure, but I'm not a known quantity, so they wouldn't pick me to do it. So it's just me researching. But the beauty of Zoom and the internet, I was able to talk to Alessia via Zoom to not only find out if she wanted to talk to me, but to see, you got to relate well on camera and have a good conversation. I was able to talk to NATA and all these people ahead of time to know how it was all going to pan out. So, or hope, try and know as best as I can how it's going to pan out.
Blair, did any of Ian's interviews and stories sort of bring you back to one of your blog pieces, Arts of War?
I think several of them do, and it's a very powerful mix which comes out in the musical segment you showed here of reinvigorating the traditional and rediscovering the traditional and casting it in a 21st century mode. And that's a theme that comes up over and over and over again in the cases I've been writing about. Yeah. And it goes back to the point I made earlier about the importance of generational change in Ukrainian culture. I mean, people who came of age since independence, so we're talking about people who are, 40, maybe as old as in their 40s, had no memory of the Soviet Union. For them, Russia was a different and unattractive country. And the Ukrainian language, they all knew no matter what they spoke at home. And that was the language that they used to express who they were. And I think this resonates with the stories you're telling, Ian, that these were the building blocks of a resilient Ukrainian society that has been able thus far to withstand a quite brutal attack.
Well, and to piggyback on that, totally, in one of the segments we were at a charity soccer tournament that NATA brought us to, and it's a fundraising company called This Is My City that's based in Chernihiv, and has expanded to way beyond its initial goals. They're really impressive. These are 20 and 30 somethings that, like we were talking about earlier, woke up in the middle of a war, and in addition to dealing with their own lives, decided, well, we got to start a charity. What can we do? And a lot of these people were also suddenly conscripted in the military. And yet they're saying, well, we got to do more. We're not just going to do that. But I was talking to them about this, about language specifically. And some of them didn't speak Ukrainian, but are taking Ukrainian lessons. So one of the guys who's in the military working for this fundraiser would come home on his days off and spend his time taking Ukrainian language lessons. So it's absolutely a really important, and he's older, to your point, to your point, it's such an identifier, a unifier, a cultural unifier to Ukrainians now. And they are all trying to, old, young alike, they're all trying to communicate, it seems like, at least to my experience there, trying to communicate in Ukrainian.
I'd like to take any questions from the audience at this point. Right here down in front. Microphone is coming to you, so just hold on a second. And if anybody else has a question, it'd be a good time to raise your hand now.
Thank you very much, Ian, and thank you for the Kennan Institute for putting this on. Michael Keys from the Kennan Institute. I guess, so I'm curious, I mean, Ukraine is multi-ethnic, I think you could say. There's a degree of diversity in that country. So there are also the groups that stick out in my mind also are Crimean Tatars, right, and Ruthenians, and I was wondering if you covered them in the program at all. And I do want to put out kind of a provocative question, is in your view, is there any room for sort of cultural preservation for the Russian-speaking Ukrainians? And then if you haven't covered the Crimean Tatars or the Ruthenians, are you going to be going back to Ukraine?
All right, help me out as I go along. But yeah, so Alessia talked about the Tatars and it just didn't fit into the interview. But I found, so here's the Alessia thing, and I'll ask you the rest of the questions. But Alessia, at the outbreak of the war, she lives in a suburb right next to Bucha or Irpin, and you know, I'm guessing in an apartment block, and you know, she saw her neighbors' apartment blocks getting bombed, shelled, decimated, and she and her husband and their 16-year-old daughter had a decision to make, whether to leave or stay. And what they decided, they sent their daughter away so she'd be safe, and then she and her husband decided to stay. And this does come back to your question, and that was my initial conversation with her. I saw actually an article on her in the Washington Post or somewhere, and I thought, okay, we're gonna go talk about that experience. And we sat down, and the way I generally interview is we just sit there and, can I swear? We just bullshit for a number of hours, and then I'm the one that gets to edit together and find my thread and that sort of thing. But we sat down and she started talking about this history that, you know, I have a degree in history. I like to feel like I know some of that stuff, but I was like, I didn't know that. I didn't know that. And she talked about the Tatars, and my understanding from her was they're primarily based in Crimea. It was right after World War II that Russia basically kicked them out and relocated them in all these satellite Soviet states and took over their homes and that sort of thing. And it went from there, and she went from there, and it's a fascinating story. And if I can, you know, in the wonderful world of YouTube, and I actually mean that, you know, I come back with all this footage and have to fit it into an hour-long episode, but I get to take these little moments that didn't work in that story, and I have to make hard choices. But I love this ability to be able to take those things and create a separate thing like that. So I'd like to. To your question about going back, we talked about that while we were there with the people that we were interviewing and saying, man, we have to come back, let's say hypothetically a year after the war ends, to see how they are and to actually dig into the beauty and happiness and wonderfulness and varied geology, cultural history, you know, all these different things of Ukraine. So I can't wait to do that. There was a third one, wasn't there, or did I get them? Yeah. All right, cool.
One thing that I noted, I'm not going to speak about Crimean Tatars. I think a lot of that has to do with what happens with Crimea, quite frankly.
Yeah.
But I think the Ruthenians really point to an East-West division. And one of the really interesting developments that the war has has brought about is that there are a number of internally displaced persons from eastern Ukraine who are now in western Ukraine. And when I take a look at the artist communities I've been looking at, the Western Ukrainian arts institutions have opened their arms and have been supporting displaced artists, musicians from eastern Ukraine, and that is creating connections that weren't there before. And I think this goes back to the whole issue of creating a Ukrainian nation wherever the boundaries are going to be. I think that those divisions are going to dissipate. I think anybody who remains in a post-war Ukraine is not going to be terribly interested in Russian culture and the Russian language. I think that also has become clear. What I don't know, and I think is an open question, is how does Ukrainian identity construct itself, and does it construct itself as a large enough tent to have a number of different communities in it? About 15 years ago, I studied immigrant communities in Ukraine. And there's really wonderful work on Afro-Ukrainians by Terrell Starr. It's not clear if the tent's going to be big enough for those groups to be included as well. And I think that's something to look at. We'll have to see. But I mean, those are open questions.
I have hope about that, as I'm willing to, I mean, especially like as you've been talking about as well, with youth, and their excitement about culture now, and being interested in all these different groups of people around. And I mean, I'm also a realist. Who knows how long that lasts? But I certainly have initial hope for. I mean, you have a whole generation of people that, at least in my limited conversations, pre-war, were not that interested in Ukraine. They were typical teenager, 20-year-olds. Well, actually, I was probably pretty interested in culture by nature of who I am, but they just weren't all that interested in it. And now they're creating things, cultural motifs to protest the war, and they're dressing in traditional Ukrainian clothes, and they're creating murals and graffiti that have all these cultural references from across the country. So hopefully they can maintain that. I asked one of the there's these sister twins called Sestry Feldman, and they're pretty famous in Kiev as street artists and muralists and drawing cartoons and stuff like that. But I said to that point that, do you think it will interest in culture will stay at this level, or maybe will it drop off a lot? And they immediately said, no, I think it'll be at a higher level. So, and whether or not that holds true, but I like the initial, the attitude at least, right? Yeah.
I guess my question following on that is, to what extent will Ukrainian culture go when it's not in opposition to invasion, to Russian, to the oppressors from Moscow, as they might say it? I mean, what do you think it'll stand for? Where will it drive the nation after the invasion?
Looking at I think this was already visible before the war, but if we talk about youth culture, the Ukrainian youth music scene was really oriented towards Central Europe. A lot of the artists would go back and forth between Berlin and places in Ukraine. I think that the draw is going to be to Europe, and in particular the kind of somewhat edgy East European youth culture that's emerged. I think, as one person said to me, for a 22, 23-year-old Ukrainian punk rocker, Berlin is the Paris of his life. And so I think when you sort of, where are the reference points going to be? The whole relationship with Poland has changed, with Polish culture has changed, and I suspect there'll be a lot of looking, I may be wrong, but I think there'll be a lot of looking to places like Warsaw and Berlin and Prague coming out of this.
During your trip, did the subject of diaspora Ukraine ever come up? The Ukrainians in Canada, I mean, I guess Toronto, the TV show came up, but any other, centers of Ukrainian diaspora come up as places that are important to what the Ukrainians are facing now?
Not in that way, but they're very, at least the people again that I talk to, they're very aware of how many Ukrainians left the country, and that there are going to be a lot of Ukrainians that don't come home. But they phrased it in a way that, to what you were saying, they would always talk about it in a way that now Ukrainians are all over the world, spreading our culture and letting the world know about our culture, not only from a cultural interest, but they would phrase it as a sort of security thing, that, next time, that's, well, anyhow, that if anything like this, God forbid, happens again, that there are Ukrainians all over the world hopefully with influence, or with neighbors with influence, and that they'll have a much better chance of avoiding this. And, again, you don't want to, we're in the middle of a war, but I think there was that element to it that, boy, having Ukrainians all around the world actually also acts as a sort of defense in a way. Yeah.
Any more questions from the audience at this point? If not, then I think we could maybe close a bit early, but I want to give Ian and Blair a final word of closing before we head out.
Well, my final word is going to be the one I began with. Take a moment to find the rest of this documentary. It really is important work, and it's an important story. And I think it's a story that, unfortunately, when we think about international politics, we don't think about the cultural dimension as much as we should. And I think, particularly having spent some time looking back over the last 30 years to see how Ukrainian culture got to where it is now, I think clearly there was a huge story taking place that was missed if you only looked at politics and economics. So I think one of the lessons I have is the lesson that informs your entire television series, which is seek out the arts and don't just view them as fluff. So
I would genuinely return the favor, because Blair, the reason I'm here is I saw your articles that you have on the website that you write every week, right? About what's going on there, and it revolves around Ukrainian culture, and that's what drew me to the Institute, was what you're writing about. So I would encourage everyone to get on the website and read what you're writing. So the width and breadth of your knowledge on the subject is, way beyond me. So check that out. Yeah.
Okay, well, with that closing thought, and I can't think of a better one for the Kennan Institute, I want to thank you for participating here today, and we look forward to seeing you at a future event. Thank you.